Welcome to the second and final part of the videos for Chapter 6 of Basic Sentential Logic and Informal Fallacies. There's really only a couple of new fallacies that we're going to talk about, and then most of this video is going to be going through further examples, sort of like practice for all of the fallacies in Chapter 6. So the first one that we're going to be talking about now is false cause. This fallacy is committed when one concludes that A causes B, when in fact all that's been shown is a correlation between A and B. So there's a premise about a correlation, but then the conclusion is about causation. That's the key idea. So let's see a couple of examples of this. Before I get into the examples, what does correlation mean? Two things are correlated when they occur together and they're absent at the same time. So to the extent that A and B are present at the same time and absent at the same time, they're correlated. So that's what a correlation is, and we'll talk more about that as the discussion of this example goes on. So here's the first example. During the past 2 months, every time the cheerleaders have worn blue ribbons, the basketball team has won. So there's your correlation. Okay, that's the premise, and it's a correlation. What are the two things that are correlated? There are two types of events. Cheerleaders wearing blue ribbons, okay, call that A, and the basketball team winning, that's another kind of event, call that B. And what this first premise is saying is, look, A and B are correlated. Every time A has happened, B has also happened. Every time the cheerleaders worn blue ribbons, the basketball team has won. Now let's get to the conclusion. What is the conclusion? If we want to keep winning, they'd better continue to wear the blue ribbons. Now, if we look back at the definition here, we'll see that it says fallacy is committed when one concludes that A causes B. Now this is important. In order for someone to commit a false cause fallacy, they have to be concluding that A causes B. Okay? But there's a lot of ways to say that A is causing B. You don't necessarily have to use the word cause. All right, so if we come back to this example, we'll see if we want to keep winning, they'd better continue to wear the blue ribbons. Now notice this conclusion isn't saying the blue ribbons are causing the winning. Okay, it's not using the word causation. Okay, but it is still a conclusion to the effect that the blue ribbons are causing winning. How can you tell? Usually you can tell because they're implying control. So here they're saying we can control the winning by controlling the blue ribbons. And that's how you know that they're talking about a causal link. Even if they don't use the word cause, they're still concluding that there's a causal relation, that A is causing B, because they're saying you can control B by controlling A. Okay, so this is false cause fallacy. The premise is just about a correlation. The conclusion is about causation. And it's about causation even though it doesn't use the word cause. It's mentioning control, but that's one of the clues that it's concluding that there's a causal link between those two things. Okay, next example. We'll return to the cheerleader example in a minute. Children become able to solve complex problems, predict the behavior of others, and think of objects objectively at the same time they learn language. Okay, so again, we've got a premise about correlation here. In this case, the correlation is the emergence of various psychological abilities in childhood. Okay, and there's one group of abilities, solving problems, predicting behavior of others, thinking of objects objectively. And the claim is that the emergence of these abilities is correlated with the emergence of this other thing, learning language. This time it does use the word causation. Okay, so I said before that it doesn't have to use the word causation in order to be telling you there's a causal link, but sometimes you can use the word causation. Now this is false cause again. Now this is interesting because this actually, well, the cheerleaders wearing blue ribbons thing, that type of thing comes up a lot. It's sort of superstition. I've seen arguments to this effect coming up a lot. Less, these days because psychologists are a little more hip to, false cause type things. But a lot of people reason this way. Let's get one more example and then we'll have some more discussion. Every time Marshawn Lynch carries more than 30 times, the Seahawks win. So all Carroll has to do to keep the Seahawks winning is give the ball to Lynch at least 30 times a game. Okay, a little background here. Marshawn Lynch is running back for the Seattle Seahawks. Carrying 30 times a game means they give him the ball at least 30 times a game to rush, basically do a running play with it. Pete Carroll is the coach of the Seahawks, or since these videos are going to be up for a long time, let me at least say that was the coach of the Seahawks at the time that I made these slides. Now this happens all the time in sports commentary. People will make this kind of claim. And you can see it is based on a correlation. A certain player running a certain kind of play more than 30 times, that's event type A. And event type B is Seahawks winning. And the premise is about a correlation. Every time this happens, that happens. The conclusion is about causation. Carroll can ensure the winning, can control the winning by controlling the number of carries. Okay, now that's also a fallacy, and we'll get to that, why it's a fallacy in a minute. First off, you can just tell it's a fallacy because the premise is merely correlation and the conclusion is about causation. That's all you need for false cause fallacy. But if you're curious as to why, you might look at that and say, well, that looks actually legit. We'll discuss it in a minute. So I want to back up a minute and sort of look at this fallacy more carefully. So the basic version of this argument is A and B are correlated, therefore A causes B. Okay? Again, the word cause may not occur. The word correlation may not occur. How can you tell when the premise is about correlation? There's a couple ways. Once you get used to it, you'll be able to spot it. But sometimes it's a temporal sequence. A happened, then B happened. Sometimes it'll be something like this. Every time A happens, B happens. Or whenever A happens a lot, B happens. Okay? Those sorts of things. What about causation? Well, sometimes they might just use the word cause, A cause B. Or might be some sort of control. If we want B, we should implement A, right? If we want to win, we should give the ball to Lynch at least 30 times. If we want the basketball team to win, we should have the cheerleader wear blue ribbons, whatever. Sometimes it can be like this. If we don't want B, we should prevent A. Okay, if we think that A is causing B, then, suppose you're the Seahawks opponent. You might think, oh, every time Lynch carries 30 times or more a game, the Seahawks win. We don't want the Seahawks to win, so we should prevent Lynch from carrying 30 times a game somehow. You might reason in that way. Now, so those are different ways that that the premises about correlation and causation can be stated. Now you might say the following, especially those of you who do major in any kind of experimental science. You might say something like, look, based on what you say, are you saying that science is based on false cause fallacies? Okay, why might someone think that? Or why might someone worry that that's what I'm saying? Well, what experiments tell us, when you run an experiment, the primary thing that tells you is a correlation. Okay, you can't really, for the most part, you can't actually see causation. Okay, but what we want is causal information. So even though experiments give us correlational information, What we want out of science is causal information. So for instance, we might want to know if, suppose A is a certain kind of compound or a drug, might want to know if A causes remission in a certain kind of cancer. How does the experiment work? Well, we give A to some patients and not to others. And if the ones we give it to experience remission and the others don't, we might think that that means that this compound causes remission. But notice that's a correlation. Everyone we gave the compound to experienced a statistically significant level of remission in their cancer or something like that. That's what the experiment tells us. And that's just a correlation. Okay. And it's similar for other experiments. You might think, gosh, Rick, are you saying that science is based on false cause fallacies? Well, no. But seeing why no, the answer is no, is hopefully will help people understand this fallacy. So if you think about it, suppose there's a correlation between two things, A and B. There are broadly speaking, there's four possible causes or explanations for this correlation. And here they are. Could be coincidence. That might explain it. So for instance, the basketball team, the cheerleaders wearing blue ribbons and the basketball team winning for the last month. In real life, that sort of thing and it happens, it would probably be a coincidence. Another thing that could explain a correlation between A and B is that A causes B. Now that's the thing we're trying to establish, let's say, by doing science. We're trying to establish that the compound causes remission. Okay, so that's also an explanation. But there's two more. Maybe B's causing A, right? That happens sometimes. So for an example of this would be the Marshawn Lynch, where the correlation is that every time Lynch carries 30 times or more a game, the Seahawks win. Now, if you understand football rules and strategy, you'll realize that really what's happening here is that B is causing A. When the Seahawks are already winning, they're like way ahead in the score, let's say, and maybe there's not a lot of time left. Or maybe there's a reasonable amount of time, but they're ahead. They're going to run the ball more than they're going to pass. Why? Because when you're ahead, you want to run out the clock so that the opponent doesn't have a chance to make a comeback. And running plays take more time off the clock than passing plays. Okay, that generally means that when teams are ahead, they run the ball more because they want to run out the clock. Okay, so probably the reason that there's this correlation between Lynch carrying 30 times or more per game, every time he does that, the Seahawks win. It's not because his carries, A, are causing the winning, B. It's because them already being in a position where they're probably going to win causes them to give him the ball more. It's causing his carries. Okay, so that's another possible explanation for a correlation. B is causing A. Because B shows up, boom, it causes A, and now you've got A and B happening together. A fourth sort of explanation is that A and B are both caused by C. And this is sometimes called common cause. Okay, meaning that C is common to both A and B. When C occurs, it's causing A and B at the same time. Now the psychology one is sort of an example of this, right? It's not that the language is causing the ability to predict the behavior of others and so forth. It's rather that there's some third thing, in this case, normal neurocognitive development, that's causing both the set of psychological abilities and language acquisition. Okay, that's why those things are correlated, is because all of them are being caused by some common cause that's in the background, so to speak. Okay, so these are four possible explanations for a correlation. But suppose what we're trying to establish is that A causes B, the second one here. How do we do that? How can we establish that this is the one that's explaining the correlation and not one of the other three? How do you do that? Well, you rule the other three out. So let's walk through. How do you rule out coincidence? Usually statistics. So depending on the science, but in a lot of psychology and bio, and it depends on the science, but a lot of times this happens through statistics. Depending on how many times these things show up together and other statistical features of the situation, you can kind of determine how likely or unlikely it is that this correlation is a result of coincidence. Now, in the example I gave of the cheerleaders wearing ribbons, if it happens over 1 month or maybe even 2 months, what do they play? One game a week. If it's 1 month, it's like 4 games. Yeah, that's a coincidence, but it's not unheard of. Things will happen you can flip a coin and it'll come up heads 4 times in a row. But how would you rule out coincidence? Suppose it keeps happening over the course of an entire season. Well, at a certain point, you might start thinking, well, maybe this isn't coincidence, right? So but you would rule it out by statistics or by having a large sample size and doing statistics over your sample size. And so that's one of the things that you will do if you're a scientist, is you need to rule out coincidence somehow. So in this case, what would you do? You'd collect data on more games. And then at some point you do statistics on it. And maybe at some point after 3 months, you'd say, well, it could be coincidence, but the odds of it being coincidence are like 0.1%. So maybe there's something going on here, right? Maybe one of our basketball players has some subconscious association with the color blue that just makes him play like a beast whenever he sees blue or something. The point is, you might at that point, if you collect data on more games and then you realize that it's really unlikely that it's coincidence, you might start looking for some other causal mechanism by which this could happen, because you ruled coincidence out. So at that point, it would have to be a common cause, B causing A or A causing B. Okay. How do you rule out B causes A? Well, you intervene with B and see if A results, right? So for instance, let's go back to the Lynch case. What you would do is you give teams a big lead and just see if they run the ball more. That's how you determine if B causes A. You create B. In this case, you just go to the NFL and you give them a big bribe and say, this game's going to start in 5 minutes, but I'll tell you what, we'll give you $50 million if we just give, the Seahawks a 28-point lead, to start off with at kickoff. And then see if that causes them to run more. Now, you'd have to do more than one game, obviously. You have to do a number of them to see if statistically implementing B actually then leads to A. But that's one of the ways you would try to do that, to see if B is causing A. Now here's another example of sort of the B causing A version of this. So the first part is the fallacy. The second part is how to test and show that it's really a B causing A. Studies show that people located in emergency rooms have a 5,000% greater chance of dying within a week than people located elsewhere. Now, I just made that stat up, but I'm pretty sure there is something like that, right? If you're in an emergency room, there is a much greater chance that you're not going to live another 7 days than if you are located elsewhere. Someone might say, well, then, if you want to kill someone, then just take them down to an emergency room, right? Because as if putting them in this environment, just only doing that is going to all of a sudden make it much, very unlikely that they're going to live out the week. Clearly what's going on here is B's causing A, right? It's the fact that someone's already in a life-threatening situation is causing them to go to the emergency room. It's not that being in the emergency room is causing them to die soon, right? Well, how do you test that? Well, you bring a bunch of healthy people to the emergency room, and then you get statistics on how long they live after that, after you've taken them there. You let them go or whatever. Afterwards, you just bring them there and say, okay, wait here for an hour. Then you can go, and then we're going to check in on you from time to time to see if you're still alive. You know, you do that sort of thing. And that's how you would try to sort of get a handle on whether B is causing A. What about common cause? How do you rule out a common cause? Well, there's a lot of ways. One way is you have a control group where everything is exactly the same except for the presence of A. And by everything is exactly the same, what you try to do is, because maybe you don't know what the C might be. It could be anything. You don't know. But you make a control group that it's subject to all the same causal influences as your study group. The only thing you do is you manipulate whether A is present. If there's a common cause, then your control group should have the same effect as your study group, right? Because you didn't change the common cause. That was there for both of them. Okay, so if you do your experiment with a control group, you manipulate the presence of A, but both your experimental group and your control group end up showing the effect that you're looking at, then that probably means that there's a common cause that you haven't isolated yet. That's something is acting on both groups, right? Your control group. There's other ways too, and my description was kind of rough, but you get the idea. Basically, and by the way, this is kind of what's happening here. This was the common cause example. How would you determine if there's a common cause? Well, you have a control group that's the same age, but whose language skills are less for whatever reason, right? Maybe you artificially impair their language development. I mean, you're not going to get IRB approval for that experiment, but something like that. And then you see if that has the effect or something. Now, that's why, let's just go back to this slide. If you've got a correlation and you're trying to determine that what you want to know is if A causes B, this is the conclusion you're trying to establish. The way to do that is to rule the other three out as possible explanations. And that's what science does. And a lot of good experimental design is focused on ruling out those other three possibilities. And if you've got a correlation and you've ruled the other three out, then the only one left, A causes B, has to be the explanation. And so that's how you do it. What makes false cause a fallacy is that, go back here, it goes from a correlation to A caused B without ruling out the other three possibilities. Okay, and that's when it's a fallacy. You just go straight from correlation to A caused B without even paying attention to trying to rule out any of the other three possible explanations. Okay, now this happens in the real world a lot. Here's an example. This is a report on from CNN on flirting in the office. The report, now I'll talk about this in a minute. This is a CNN report on a scientific study, which is relevant. We'll get to that at the end, but here's what the report says. Flirting at the office is not only taboo, but it could even take a toll on your financial future. That's the kind of headline bumper. Women who cross their legs provocatively, wear short skirts, or massage a man's shoulders at work get fewer pay raises and promotions, according to Friday's USA Today. The newspaper, citing a Tulane University study, said 49% of female MBA graduates polled admitted they had tried to advance their careers by sometimes engaging in certain sexual behaviors, including sending flirty emails and wearing revealing clothing. The respondents who said they never engaged in such activity earned an average of 3 promotions versus 2 for the group that had employed sexuality. Those who said they never used sexuality were on average in the 75 to 100K income range. The other group fell on average in 50 to 75K range. So here's the correlation. You've got a whole bunch of people in the workforce, and the data is that a certain sort of behavior, namely, whatever it is, overt sexuality or something in the workplace, is correlated with a certain set of financial features, right? Fewer raises and less average income, that sort of thing. Okay, so there's a correlation. Tulane professor Arthur Brief said the study suggests that women should be careful about letting men open doors or lift boxes that are particularly heavy because chivalry is benevolent sexism. We argue there are negative consequences for women who use sexuality in the workplace. Well, the conclusion now is about causation, right? Because they're saying that, look, you can control you have some control at least over your financial features, right? Number of raises, average income, by controlling your sexual behavior in the workplace, right? So the conclusion that's being drawn here is a causal one. And you can see, at least so far, not a lot's been done to rule out the other three possibilities. Now, it says there's 164 women in the study. That's a good number, statistically speaking. If it was just 4, that would be one thing, but 164, that's pretty good stats. The odds that that's a coincidence are not really good. Just off the top of my head, I can tell you that that's probably pretty good for ruling out coincidence. But there's still 2 other possible explanations that would need to be ruled out before you could really legitimately draw a causal conclusion. You'd have to rule out B causing A, right? Which seems possible in this case. It might be that women who aren't getting promoted, they think they should get promoted, but they're not promoted, or they're making less money than they think they should be making, might feel more pressure to act in certain kinds of ways, whereas women who are already getting promoted a lot and making more money feel less pressure to do that. So it could be B causing A, maybe, or it could easily be common cause, right? It could be that there's a certain, again, I'm just brainstorming here, but this is the kind of thing you'd have to rule out if you wanted to establish causation of A causing B. Maybe there's just a certain kind of psychological mindset, call it a professional mindset, that causes a certain group of women to both not behave a certain way in the workplace and also to work in such a way that they're just going to get more raises and make more money, right? Whereas another kind of mindset causes a different group to just be less professional, right? They engage in more sexual behavior, but they also approach work in such a way that they just naturally get fewer raises and fewer promotions. So that would be a potential case of excuse me, hopefully that wasn't too loud, sneezing right in the mic. It's possible that could happen, but that's the sort of thing you would want to rule out somehow if you wanted to establish that it's the sexual behavior that's causing the less income. Now, this is a report on the original study. Now, it could very well be that if you go to the Tulane University study itself, the one published by Brief and colleagues, in that full research report, they may have actually done some work to rule out those other 3 options. Okay, so it might be that if you looked at that argument that they give in the original report, there wouldn't be a false cause fallacy, because maybe they do rule out the other 3. Here, though, at least everything we're seeing in this report, they don't rule those 3 out. So the argument here is a false cause fallacy. It's not establishing that A is causing B, but it is concluding that A is causing B, sort of fallaciously. Not just women, men also are subject to false cause, fallacy sort of advice. Here's the article. I do. These two words may make blah, many grown men shudder. If you're one of those guys, let me ask you this. Do you want to live a longer, happier, healthier life? You do, great. Then you should know that research is clear. Getting married is one of the best investments you can make in your overall health. So here we can tell that they're already sort of implying causation. If you want to live longer and healthier, get married. You can control the length and happiness of your life by controlling whether or not you get married. So the conclusion is a causal one. What's the premise? Or what are the premises that they're appealing to? Consider this recent study in BMC. It's a British public health journal. Researchers looked at data from more than 400,000 Norwegian patients recorded over nearly 40 years. Never married men had a 35% greater chance of dying from cancer than married guys. The odds were 10% greater for widowed men and 16% greater for divorced men. So they're pointing out a correlation between these two things, but they're not ruling out the others. Now, again, it's probably not coincidence. You've got 400,000 patients in this. That's a huge number. So if they're finding a correlation with 400,000 sources of data, odds are probably pretty slim that that's coincidence. I mean, you'd want to look at the original study, but off the top of my head, I'm saying that's probably not the case. Could there be a common cause? Well, maybe there's a certain kind of approach to what you do in your life that both leads certain men to act in a healthier way and leads them to be more likely to get married, right? And a different approach to life that leads other men to act in a way that's not healthy and to avoid marriage, let's say. Could it be B causing A? I have a hard time thinking of a plausible way that could work, right? A way that, living a shorter life causes you to not get married somehow. I'm not sure how that would work. Like you ask a woman to marry you and she can like look in the future and see that you're not going to live very long. So she says no. I don't know how that would work. But the point is, there are these other three possibilities. And the only one that we have any evidence was ruled out is coincidence because it's a pretty big N here. By the way, there's a website you can go to. I think it might be this actually, Tyler Vegan or Vegan, whatever.com. But there's a website by some, I think it's a Yale or Harvard stats grad student maybe who did this. Don't quote me on that. My memory on the person might be vague. But they just have huge numbers of correlations that are pretty bizarre, that these things are correlated, but where there's no conceivable causal link. Here we're seeing the divorce rate in Maine per 1,000 people plotted against the per capita consumption of margarine from the years 2000 to 2009. And you can see a pretty impressive correlation there. And there's like hundreds of things like this, just crazy ass correlations. This is cute. I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class, or a logic class in this case. Now I don't. Sounds like the class helped. Well, maybe. Get it as a joke, right? The premise is there's a correlation. I took the class, and then I stopped thinking that correlation implied causation. This person is assuming that there was a causal link, and this person says, well, see, anyway. Next, fallacy. Hasty generalization. And this is the last fallacy, I believe. It's committed when the arguer draws a conclusion about all members of a group from characteristics of a few members. It's a fallacy if there's no reason to think the example individuals are typical. Now, there's a number of ways this can go wrong, and we'll talk about some of these. The sample might be too small, or the sampling might be systematically biased. So dig this example. I think I won't accept a job at Office Depot. My boss would be a woman, and at my last job, my boss was a woman. She said she was the worst boss I've ever had. So this is clearly a hasty generalization. By the way, I'm realizing that a lot of these examples I'm going to be using here involve, women and implicit sexism and stuff like that. I don't know why I have so many examples like that. Apologies about that. Maybe I should put some more that have to do with men. But anyway, you can see that this is hasty generalization because there's just one sample point, which is just this guy's last boss. Assume it's a guy, it could be a woman for all we know, who's making this argument. But either way, it's just one example, the previous boss, and then they're clearly generalizing this to all possible female bosses. So hopefully this is clear, but I'm going to get back to this in a minute. Here's an example from real life. This was my mother. This is when I lived in Pittsburgh. She would call to talk, and she would, "Oh, what are you doing?" "Well, I happen to be watching football." And one time when I said that, she said something like this: "Well, you spend all your time watching football. I've called you over a dozen times in the last few months, and every single time you're watching football. Don't you have a job or any friends?" So here, it was true that she called a lot. So the number of sample points wasn't small. Okay. There was another kind of error, though, in the sampling, which is that it was systematically biased. For whatever reason, I don't know what it was, she would only call on Sunday afternoons, which is when the NFL games happen. Okay. Now, so it just happened to be that her sampling of what I was doing by calling me and saying, "Hey, what are you doing?" only occurred once a week at a certain time, right? And that just happened to be a sort of regular schedule that this certain kind of event was also on. So from a sampling standpoint, it looks like, oh, holy crap, I've collected 100 samples and every single one of them is Rick's watching football. The conclusion is Rick watches football 100% of the time, right? Well, that's false because I would watch football a small percentage of the time, but it would be a small percentage on a regular schedule. And if the sampling happened to follow that schedule, you would get a false idea about what's really going on. Now, think about this example for a minute. Farmer Bob used Stinky Winky fertilizer at 3 spots on his cornfield, and at those 3 spots, the corn plants died. All the other plants in the field lived. Stinky Winky fertilizer is obviously bad for corn plants. So the situation is this. Suppose you got 5,000 acres, which is a lot. That's a lot of corn plants. And suppose there's just 3 square meters. They don't even have to be next to each other. They might be spread out. But there's 3 1 square meter patches where this certain fertilizer was used. And at all of the rest of the locations it wasn't used. Maybe there's a different fertilizer, maybe no fertilizer, whatever. But that particular fertilizer was not used. And and the result was that all the corn plants in those 3 square meters died. The corn plants elsewhere lived and were fine. Now, if you look at this is still a generalization, right? It's generalizing from a very small sample to the conclusion that anytime you use this fertilizer, it's going to kill corn plants. Okay? By the way, you might wonder if this is also a false cause because there's a correlation and they're implying causation. And I think there is also a false cause element to it too. I'll talk about the relation between false cause and hasty generalization in a sec. But there's also a generalization element because they're going from a small sample, something that's true of a small sample, and then assuming it's going to be true of the larger, like all of the corn plants. Well, what's the difference here? Why is it that this one seems okay? When I say okay, what do I mean? I mean, if this is all you knew, and you were a farmer growing corn plants, and your livelihood depended on your corn living, would you use this fertilizer based on this information? I'm hoping you say no, because if you say yes, you should just stay out of business. I certainly wouldn't. If this is all I knew and I had to make a choice, I would say, okay, I'm just going to avoid that brand of fertilizer. But why is this any better than the Office Depot example? And this is a tiny sample size here, 3 square meters, and then drawing a conclusion about all corn plants. One previous boss drawing a conclusion about all future female bosses. This one seems intuitively, and I think correctly, this is bad. This is a hasty generalization. That's a fallacy. This one doesn't seem bad at all. This seems like a pretty good piece of reasoning. What's the difference? Well, there's a few differences, but I think the key difference is that, let's go back to the definition. Hasty generalization. It's a fallacy if there's no reason to think that the example individuals are typical. Okay. That plays into how typical you think your samples are, plays into how big of a sample you need to establish a generalization. Now, in this case, the Home Depot case, humans are very different psychologically. Some people are very cooperative. Some people are very adversarial. Some people are very friendly. Some are very unfriendly. Some are very competent. Some are incompetent. There's huge variation in individuals. So if I have experience with one person who's a woman, or one person who's a college graduate, or one person who's got dark hair, or whatever, generalizing to, from the psychological characteristics of that one person to all people is going to be really dicey because people are just so different. Okay, and we know that intuitively. That's why this seems bad. Okay, is that subconsciously you just know that people are very different, and so just having experience with one person, that's not representative. Now, if this person had, let's say, 100 female bosses and didn't get along with all of them, all 100 of them, and then concluded, well, then I probably won't get along with any female boss. That might be a good conclusion, right? If you have 100 examples and a certain dynamic holds from all 100, maybe that's enough to give you your generalization. Now, of course, it doesn't say why there would be problems, right? Maybe in all 100 cases, the reason there are problems is that the person making this argument is, a sexist asshole. Sorry, now I have to put explicit on this. Is a sexist jerk, right? And just causes conflict with women, and that's why they never get along. So this doesn't have to be about what the causal mechanism of them not getting along is, but if there's 100 examples, then maybe you could generalize. But I think everyone agrees that you can't generalize from one example. Whereas here with the corn plants, corn plants and other species of plants tend to be biologically pretty similar. Maybe not 100% similar. I mean, there is going to be some genetic variation. That's what gets evolution off the ground, is that there's going to be some genetic variation. But, 99 times out of 100, stuff that kills one plant is going to kill another. Stuff that nurtures one plant is going to nurture another, and so on. And we kind of subconsciously know that there's great uniformity. If you know there's a lot of uniformity, then that means you can use sort of a smaller sample size. Or put it this way, a small sample you can have confidence is still going to be representative of the larger group if you just have some reason to believe that they're very uniform along some dimension. In this case, they're biological characteristics. Okay. This is from the old TV show Batman. Here's the setup of this particular episode. Batman and Robin caught Catwoman doing something illegal, and we're getting ready to take her into jail. And she said, well, do you mind if I put on some makeup first, or something like that? And being the gentlemen that they are, Batman and Robin said, well, yeah, okay, go ahead and, when you're done, we'll take you into jail. And she pulled out some makeup case that really had like a dart gun in it or something. And she like got Batman and Robin with these sort of knockout darts and escaped. And this was the exchange that occurred in this episode. Robin did not like that. I guess you can never trust a woman. Batman says, you've made a hasty generalization, Robin. It's a bad habit to get into. Okay. Now, let's compare false cause and hasty generalization. They can be confused. And a lot of times arguments will do both. There's both a generalization part of an argument and a kind of causal part of an argument. So some arguments might commit both fallacies. But here's how you distinguish them. Well, first off, here's why they seem confusing. All of them, false cause fallacy, hasty generalization fallacy, they're based on noticing a correlation and then drawing a certain kind of bad conclusion from that correlation. That's what they have in common. The difference is, there's two differences: the type of correlation and especially the type of conclusion that's being drawn. False cause requires a conclusion about a causal relationship. Okay? In fact, let me change this. Requires a conclusion about a causal relationship. Okay? And you can tell if they're implying control. So with false cause, there might not be a move from some to all. Okay? The data that you're appealing to might be all members of the group. You might have all of the data about all of the A's and all of the B's. The problem is that there's a move to a causal relation. Okay? So for example, let's look at this. We've closely examined every human being who's ever died, and we found that they all have hydrogen atoms in their body somewhere, usually lots of them. Therefore, hydrogen causes death. Notice here that, first off, the conclusion should tip you off that maybe it's a false cause fallacy because they're specifically talking about causation. Okay, but still it's worth examining the rest of it to see if it's a sort of prototypical false cause or maybe there's an element of hasty generalization. Well, if you look here, the premise is we've examined every human being who's ever died. Okay, everyone. Notice that the premise isn't about some of the examples. It's not saying, well, we've examined 100 people who have died and they all had hydrogen in their bodies. Therefore, we think everyone has hydrogen in their bodies. That would be a move from some to all. Here, the premise is already about all. We've examined every human being who's ever died. Of course, in real life, I don't know how that would happen, but just assume for the case of this example that they did that. It couldn't possibly be hasty generalization, right? If you've examined all of the examples, because hasty generalization is where you're going from a subset to a larger set. You're looking at a few and drawing conclusions about all. If your premise is already about all, you can't possibly be generalizing, okay? And here they're not. Here the problem is that they're making a causal connection, okay? Hasty generalization, on the other hand, doesn't have to involve any causal claim. It's entirely about a move from some examples to all examples, okay? From some corn plants, what will kill some corn plants to what will kill all corn plants, okay? So for instance, we examined 10 bodies chosen at random of the 100 bodies discovered at the ancient burial site. All 10 of them had spear wounds in their heads. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude that all of the bodies will have spear wounds in their heads. Well, notice this isn't making a causal claim. It's not saying the spear wounds caused death, and there's no other causal claim going on here. There's no control that's being implied or anything like that. What they're saying is that we've looked at a certain small number of these, and they've had a certain feature, and they're concluding that all of them are going to have that feature. Okay? They've examined 10 bodies, but they're drawing a conclusion about all of the bodies. Okay? There's no claim about causation. They aren't saying that the spears are causing death. It's purely about a move from some to all. Okay? And that's kind of the basic way to think about the difference. So when you've got an argument that's making a move from certain observations to something, right? Look at the nature of the observations. Is the observations about all members, or is it about some? And then look at the conclusion. Is the conclusion about all, so that the argument is a move from some have feature X to all have feature X? Or is the conclusion about a causal link when you only had a correlation in the premises? Now, I said that false cause could involve looking at 100% of the examples. It doesn't have to. Sometimes you only look at a handful of the examples, and you could still make a false cause fallacy. Okay, but this is the basic idea behind the difference between these two types of fallacy. Okay, let's look at some additional examples. Michael Jordan says Sprayovac batteries help save the environment, so I don't buy any other brand. Is there an argument here? Well, there's kind of an implicit argument that Sprayovac batteries are the best, or have some feature that this person likes, namely that they're good for the environment. Why does the person think that? Well, because Michael Jordan said so. So this is an appeal to authority fallacy. First off, any kind of commercial endorsement by a celebrity is automatically appeal to authority, because even if they're a expert in that field, they're being paid to say what they're saying, so you can't necessarily believe it. But in this case, more importantly, you've got a basketball player talking about environmental features of a chemical entity, a battery. Okay, so clearly it's appeal to authority. If we legalize euthanasia for elderly people who want to die, then what about cases where the person can't speak? Then it will be made a law that if the relatives think that the person would want to be put to death, then they will be euthanized. Then any time an old person becomes a burden, their children will just take them down to the hospital to have them killed. This is actually pretty common type of fallacy in this field, euthanasia. And you can see it's slippery slope, right? And what the person is saying, well, look, if we take this first step, legalizing euthanasia for people who want to die, maybe that sounds innocent, but then look, what'll happen next? Well, think about the cases where the person can't speak. They can't tell you that they want to die. Well, then it'll be a law that if the relatives think that that's what the person wants, then they'll euthanize them. And then that'll lead to this situation where anytime an old person becomes a burden, their children will just take them down to the hospital to have them killed. So you can see there's this sequence of events. My intuition is that that's an unlikely sequence. I think it's a perfectly reasonable and doable thing to, legalize the first thing, but then make safeguards so that the follow-up kinds of things don't happen, right? Instead of a slippery slope, it could be a nice grippy slope. But you could sort of test that by looking at data from various countries who've implemented euthanasia laws and see if, in fact, the first time they implement a euthanasia law, these other things follow, or if they don't, and you can sort of test it that way. As the number of laws on the books has increased over the past 50 years, the number of crimes committed has also increased. So if we reduce the number of laws, we will reduce crime. This one's tricky in a certain kind of way, but you should be able to see that it's a false cause fallacy. The premise is about two things being correlated, the number of laws on the books and the number of crimes committed. And there's a causal link being inferred here. we can control the amount of crime by controlling the number of laws. That's the basic analysis of this. Now, that said, let's dig a little bit deeper here. Someone might say, well, it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you get rid of all the laws, then nobody could commit a crime, right? If crime is by definition breaking a law, then one way you could eliminate all crime is by eliminating all laws. Well, technically that's true, but notice that the person making this, and in this case, this was my dad who made this argument to me. When they say they want to reduce crime, what do they mean by that? Do they mean that, hey, the goal we should all have is to reduce the number of things that qualify as crimes? No, that's not what they mean. What they mean is let's reduce the number of bad things that happen that are criminal behavior, robberies, murders, whatever, that sort of thing. That's what they're trying to say. We can reduce a certain kind of bad event from occurring. And they're just calling that bad event crimes. But the important thing is reducing the number of these bad events that happen, not reducing the number of things that qualify for the label crime. So given that the conclusion, sensibly, if you look at this, you think the only person who was making this argument has to be thinking that the goal is to reduce the number of bad things that occur, then this is clearly a false cause fallacy. Okay, you can't reduce the number of bad things by reducing the number of laws on the book, or at least this argument doesn't show that. Okay. Ben says, how come I didn't get invited to your party? Sally says, because you're the most boring person I've ever met and you always smell like crap. This might look like ad hominem abusive, right? Because Sally is saying some insulting or very negative things about Ben here. But remember, as always, you can't just say, oh, it fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive, therefore it's ad hominem abusive. You say, oh, okay, it fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive. Now I'm going to look more carefully and see, is it really committing this fallacy? In this case, what you want to know is, are the bad things that are being said, are they relevant to the conclusion? Now, if someone is boring, and if they do smell like crap, that might be a relevant consideration as to whether or not you invite them to a party. I'm just saying. So in this case, it's not necessarily a fallacy, right? So even though the premise involves some things that are kind of insulting, they're arguably relevant to the conclusion. And so it's not, in this case, I would say this is not an ad hominem abusive fallacy. This is not a fallacy at all. Okay, one more example, and then we will wrap up. Actually, no, I'll save that example for the lecture in class. So that's it. This is the last video for chapter 6, which is the last chapter. So that's it. Good luck, study hard, and have fun on the final exam.